Hi, I'm Talia. I'm a PhD student in Northeastern University in Boston, and I'm also an external consultant to the OECD. So I'm going to present my research that is partially mine, partially with them. The question that I think about a lot, and I think relates a lot to what Merav was talking about, is where the truly disadvantaged people. This is a question that, or basically the title of a book, The Truly Disadvantaged, by William Wilson, that was a professor, or still a professor at Harvard, that started doing social research in Chicago in the 70s and 80s, asking the question of why there's so many disadvantaged people that stayed in the center of the city, in those ghettos, and didn't have anywhere to go, and what were the problems that they were facing. And he thought a lot about these people and what they didn't have, and one of the things that he brought into surface is the fact that they didn't have services. They were unserviced by their city. The city was choosing to service better the people that had privileges. So the way that I'm facing this is by creating tools for decision makers and for ordinary people, daily people, to think about their neighborhoods from a different perspective. The major problem that I'm facing, and maybe I could put this on a personal note, in my profession, is an architect, a city planner, and a data scientist. So in some level, I talk all three languages, from the very, very small scale to the very big scale. And from the get-go of my architecture education or training here in Israel, I realized that there were no decisions that were based on data when you think about design. And then when you scale it up to cities, basically it remains the same. There's no big difference of how you make decisions of why to put X here or not there. And this becomes a really huge problem when policymakers make decisions every day of where to locate the next school or park or commercial facilities, when they are battling the field with developers that have a lot of analysts that talk the data science talk, and they have much more analytics to support why this argument of putting their high-rise here is better for them financially, while the city planners say, maybe I need a little bit more commercial space, maybe I need a little bit more office space, or if you give me A, I'll give you B. And I'm talking from experience because I sat in these planning tables constantly, and I thought to myself, there's a better way, there should be a better way. And I guess that's how I ended up doing data-driven metrics for decision making. So that's the big question, and the focus here is land use planning. Land use planning is בעברית שימושי קרקע. So in every city, and you can think about it in America, it's zoning, it's called. When we want to allocate resources, there are plans in different scales that talk about where to put different uses. So where to cluster the commercial facilities, the office space, where to put the residential buildings, and so forth. And the thing itself, the practice of what zoning is really, really simple. Basically, it's the quantities of how many residential units you need, how many restaurants you need, commercial space, how many parks you need, etc. And then the big problem of how you organize them in space. Now, if we have, as planners, or as, like in general, what the science has taught us well is how to predict population growth and how many more people we will have in a certain area, maybe we can predict to some degree, and I'll show you some of this, the quantities that are needed. But where to put them in space is maybe the largest problem that decision makers have been facing for the last 200 years, ever since cities started to be a phenomena by itself, and there's no good mechanism to actually make that decision. And why is that? So I really like this quote, and I think I'm going to read it. So Riddle and Weber in '73 talked about why planning is so complicated, why it's such an issue. And they say the search for scientific basis for confronting problems of society policy is bound to fail. Because of the nature of these problems, they are wicked problems, whereas science has developed to deal with tame problems. policy problems cannot be definitely described. Moreover, it's a pluralistic society. There is nothing like the undisputable public good, which is really, really important. There is no objective definition of equity. Policies that respond to social problems cannot be meaningfully correct or false. And it makes no sense to talk about optimal solution to social problems unless severe qualifications are imposed first. Even worse, there are no solutions per se, in the sense of definitive and objective answers. When I found that quote, it was later in my work, and I was so happy. There are people in the 70s that thought like me, because in the 70s, basically, there were all these land use transport analysts that were talking about, if you live in one place and you work in that place, this is how the transport system should look like, and this is how the city should be organized around it. And that was coming from a point of view of, you're optimizing for what? Are you optimizing for the car? For the people to commute to work? What are you optimizing for? And I guess that's the major issue here, to think about when you create these kind of tools for decision makers, and it's not only for land use planning, it's basically in decision making, everything. It can be in economy and all of the other issues that public policy faces all the time, is what are you optimizing for? It's just in a city, it's really, really obvious that one trumps the other, basically. So the way that I think about it in my research is, I'm not trying to define the optimal good. I'm not trying to define who I'm optimizing for. I'm trying to understand the components and the game rules of how these things interact with what. And like a city, as you can see here, it's just like a simple Lego game, basically. What you create are rules of what can come with what. And if I can think of, or I should, or try to predict, and I've been asked this question a couple of times in the last 2 years, how would city planning look like, or specifically land use planning look like in 30 years or 50 years, I would say it would be like a big, great SimCity game, which I'm sure a lot of the people in this room know what it is. That basically the policy place, or the planning place in this, is to determine these game rules, but not to determine the outcome. It's not a deterministic type planning that in 30 years from now, can blow up the city and say, this is how it's going to look like in 3D. No, I'm only going to know how this relates to this in the scale of like how a park relates to a school, it relates to a residential building and so forth, in the scale of a building or a block or neighborhood and so forth. So the way that I go about quantifying these relationships in the macro and micro scale, the macro, as I said, is like how many of these building blocks I need in a city, how to distribute them amongst the city, and how to co-locate them, which is basically the hardest thing. So there's, how am I with time, by the way? Sorry. So I have, sorry, I didn't look at it before. 5 minutes, wow. Okay, so I'm gonna skip this. The data that I have here is it comes from 3 sources. The accessibility work is done with the OpenStreetMap, that is 80% full, globally full. The data for people comes from the global human settlement layer, which is data that comes from NASA and the European Commission of where people live in a very fine-grained resolution everywhere in the world. And the data that I work with for land use comes from Google, which is a very unique data set because it has a consistent index across the world. And basically what I'm trying to find is consistent patterns that are across cities, and for that I need a different data set. That's why I came across Google, because if you can think about what happens in cities, every city has its own index of what land use is, and that's why Google is such a good opportunity to think about land use patterns in a greater scale. So in terms of how many building blocks, I'm going to go through this as fast as possible. Basically what I'm showing here is that when you know, I'm trying to make this as less scientific as possible. When you know the number of people in a city, you can basically predict the number of amenities that you need. That's what these graphs are showing. And we can do that now, not only in terms of how globally, like how many amenities we need in general, but we can look at it base by base, by type. So it works even when you break up the type of amenity. Here in the middle you see universities, and here you see takeaway restaurants. And basically what I try to create with this is signatures for cities. So if you think about this as a pattern, okay, all cities, and this is right for, I'm showing here data for the 50 largest cities in the US, but it's right for French cities, for German cities, it will be right for Israeli cities, it's right everywhere. There's a lot of research that supports this. Then you can take this, this line that is basically the common average and plot a city and say, how is the city performing in contrast to the average? And it's not good or bad, it's just what it is, okay? So Boston is really, really strong, and whoever was there knows that there's a ton of museums and hospitals and universities and such, and a lot of parks as well, but there's not a lot of commercial activity. When you look at San Francisco, the picture is really, really different, and it becomes really, really interesting in these kind of cases. Washington, when I went to the World Bank and I talked there, they said, yeah, this explains why after 5 p.m. we don't have anything to do here. And in LA, of course, there's like a lot of deficiencies and a lot of different amenities. And above the line doesn't mean that you're good, because a shrinking city has more amenities than what it actually needs. So again, this line of above or below is not me saying you have more or less and that is good or bad. It's just what it is. Let's just show you what you actually have. I'm gonna skip this. So basically I can do this on the spatial scale as well. I want to go too fast here. And I can basically, at the end of the day, tell decision makers, create these signatures and say, both in terms of the quantities and the spatial distribution, I'm not going to talk about this extensively, where are you sitting? Like, are your amenities equally spread around the city or not? And how you are over or underperforming. But the really important thing is the accessibility stuff. So what I do is I take these points of when you saw the gridded population of the world, and I take every point and I calculate on the world network what is the closest park, bar, restaurant, and such. And this gives me in fine-grained resolution the ability, this is data for, all 80 cities in France. Just very basic understanding of what is the average walking distance that a person should walk to the closest restaurant, park, and such. And when you look at these maps, just as Mirav said, it's not giving you a ton. It's really not giving you a ton. But then, when you start doing things like in this world you do, no, it's not opening up. It was open in another one. Here, yes. Yeah, but now it's, okay, sababa. So this is data for Boston, just because this was a mock-up for a data viz. But basically, if you think about it, we can make accessibility in a way that a lot of people can relate to. So here I'm showing, basically from all of these grid cells, how many people live in those areas. This is, of course, downtown Boston, where the majority of people live. And what is the average walking distance to an amenity of type X? So, first of all, you can definitely imagine or think about 10 minutes, basically, 10 minutes is the average walking distance that you, if you think about yourself, is the maximum that you will walk when you want to walk to a supermarket, for example, or a restaurant and such. So you can look at it like this. But then it becomes really interesting if you say, I want to live in a place where I can walk to a park in 2 minutes. Like, that is the thing that my kid really needs. So if you do this, sorry, the Wi-Fi is not like, if you do this, you can see that basically only in one place in Boston you can walk to a park in 2 minutes, but it becomes better and better as you create the filtering process that is different. And I think I'm running over time, right? Surely running over time. Yes, no? Yes? I'm gonna finish in a second. Let me just go back to the... basically, what I can do is I can do this on larger and larger and larger scales. This is what the data allows me to do. And what you're seeing here is not only the accessibility, but the diversity of accessibility. So if we're talking about parks, basically, there's some cities in France, what you're seeing here, that more more than 50% of the population don't have the ability to walk to a park. This is what you see in purple here, no access. What I'm trying to tell with data here in terms of the story is that there's a ton of ways to look, and there's like, this is only the beginning. There's so much more that can be done, but this is only just to show decision makers what is there, and also to show people, to give communities their own, like, just as Jer said, their own usage of the data, their own power with the data, and I think there's a ton that you can do once you put things like this together and start making decisions based on data. Thank you very much.